In the 15th to 18th centuries, a wave of paranoia swept through Europe as thousands were accused of witchcraft amid rampant fear and religious fervor. From Germany and France to Scotland and Switzerland, witch hunts led to roughly 50,000 to 100,000 executions over 350 years. Torture was routinely employed to elicit confessions, and a guilty verdict meant a death sentence by some of the most brutal methods imaginable. Today, we're delving into some of the most horrifying punishments inflicted during Europe's witch hunting frenzy. Punishments that reflect the extreme fear and fanaticism of the age. One early ordeal for suspected witches was the search for the devil's mark. It was believed that witches bore a hidden mark or extra nipple where their demonic familiars suckled. Interrogators would strip the accused and shave their body to expose any blemish or mole. Professional witch prickers were then paid to jab needles and pins into the suspect's flesh, sometimes all over their body, until they found a spot that did not bleed or feel pain. Supposedly the witch's mark where the devil had sealed his pact. In their zeal, some fraudster prickers even used trick blades that retracted into the handle, creating the illusion of piercing flesh without drawing blood. This gruesome poking and prodding was agonizing and humiliating. Victims, often terrified and exhausted, would be stabbed dozens of times, desperate to prove their innocence in a test rigged against them. It was a cruel catch. 22. If they screamed in pain and bled, they were merely human, but likely still suspected. If they didn't, they were deemed witches marked by Satan. Such evidence of guilt would then be used to justify further torture or execution. One of the most common tortures in European witch trials was the strappado, a method explicitly recommended in the infamous 1486 witch hunter's manual, Malleus Maleficarum. In this ordeal, the victim's hands were tied behind their back and attached to a rope. The executioners would then hoist the accused into the air by this rope, pulling the arms painfully backward. With a sudden release, the prisoner would drop, often stopping short before hitting the ground, causing their own body weight to violently yank the arms and shoulders. This often resulted in dislocated shoulders and tearing pain. According to the Malleus Maleficarum, jailers were instructed to prepare their implements and, if a prisoner would not confess, to make the prisoner fast to the strappado or some other implement of torture. The victim could be raised and dropped repeatedly, increasing the agony each time. Under such excruciating pain, many broke down. Interrogators would pause to demand confessions, then continue the torment if answers were unsatisfactory. The strappado left no external blood or wounds, but the internal damage, torn ligaments, stretched sockets, was severe. It exemplified the era's brutal logic. Extreme pain was not only justified, but necessary to combat what was seen as an ultimate evil. Not all torture devices were large. Some were handheld instruments of terror. Thumbscrews, also known as pillywinks, were a commonly used torment, especially in Scotland and Germany. This device was essentially a vice for human digits. The accused witch's thumb, or sometimes all the fingers, would be placed into a small metal press between two flat boards. With each turn of the screw, the boards would clamp tighter, painfully crushing the thumb bit by bit. Interrogators could tighten it gradually, increasing pressure until bones splintered. In Edinburgh's Tolbooth prison, for example, thumb screws were very commonly used on accused witches. The pain was disproportionate to the size of the device. Victims described feeling fiery agony as their fingernails cracked and knuckles were ground to pulp. Scottish records from the North Berwick witch trials recount how a healer named Gillis Duncan had the pillywinks put on her fingers until she named accomplices. Likewise, another accused, John Fian, a schoolmaster, was subjected to torture by thumbscrews as well as the boot during his examination. In the cramped confines of a cell, the sight of these simple iron screws struck terror. They allowed torturers to inflict controlled, focused pain, all while calmly urging the prisoner to confess. By the time the screws were loosened, a suspect's hands might be left mangled, and their resolve utterly shattered. Even the process of determining guilt could itself be deadly. One infamous trial by ordeal was the swimming test, used in many European locales, especially in the 17th century, to prove a witch's guilt or innocence. In this bizarre and barbaric practice, the accused would be brought to a pond or river, stripped to their undergarments, bound, and then tossed into the water. Because witches were believed to have rejected the sacrament of baptism, it was thought that water would reject them, meaning a witch would float, unable to sink, as the pure water cast out their evil. Conversely, an innocent person, free of sin, was expected to sink like a stone. Of course, this meant that floating sealed your fate. You would be condemned as a witch, whereas sinking could mean drowning. Typically, a rope was tied around the victim's waist so they could be pulled up after sinking, in theory, to prevent death. In practice, panic and chaos often ensued, and accidental drownings were not uncommon. Many women and men subjected to the swimming test flailed in terror as crowds watched from the banks. If their bodies bobbed to the surface, onlookers took it as proof of sorcery. One 18th century account from Hungary describes a woman who floated during the test. She was promptly pulled out, beaten, and later burned at the stake as a witch. The ordeal by water was thus a no-win situation. A suspected witch who sank might die, but one who survived the water would face execution. This so-called test was really just another form of punishment, an early torment in the witch-hunting process that played on primal fears of drowning. It exemplified the cruel superstition over reason that defined the witch craze. The ultimate fate for those convicted of witchcraft in Europe was often to be burned alive at the stake. Death by fire was the traditional punishment for heresy, and witchcraft was deemed a heresy against God. While England generally chose to hang condemned witches as common felons, in most of continental Europe, including Germany, France, Switzerland, and Scotland, the standard execution was to tie the witch to a wooden stake and set them ablaze. Sometimes a merciful executioner would strangle or behead the victim before the flames were lit, to spare them the pain of burning. But many were burned quick, alive, suffering a death of unspeakable agony. The process was a public spectacle. The condemned person, often already weakened by torture, would be led to a pyre piled with wood. The sentencing court or clergy would declare that the witch be consumed by fire so that their evil could be purged. When the torches ignited the brushwood, the unlucky victim was engulfed in flames before the eyes of assembled townsfolk. Historical records from Central Europe detail hundreds of such executions during intense witch panics. For example, at Würzburg and Bamberg in Germany, mass burnings occurred. In Bamberg alone, around 900 alleged witches were burned in a few years. Scotland too saw an enormous number of burnings. Roughly 4,000 people were burned as witches there, an astonishing figure for a small country. Being burned alive is one of the most painful deaths imaginable. Skin charring, lungs seared by hot air, nerve endings on fire. Victims might emit blood-curdling screams until the smoke and flames stole their voice. On some occasions, bags of gunpowder were tied to the condemned to hasten death by explosion. In other cases, they writhed until the ropes gave way and they fell, half dead, into the coals. Crowds treated these executions as both morbid entertainment and moral lesson. The rationale was that fire would purify the soul and prevent any remnant of the witch from continuing to harm the living. But in truth, burning at the stake served as a terrifying warning to the public, a visual representation of hell on earth. It ingrained fear in the populace and demonstrated the lengths to which authorities would go to eradicate the alleged servants of Satan. If you found this exploration into the horrifying punishments of the European witch trials interesting, be sure to check out our video on life of a galley slave during the Age of Sail, on your screen now. But if you've made it this far, thank you for watching, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next one.